Totemist. The Poet's House. Growing up, I was always different from the other children. My mom would explain it to relatives at family gatherings. Tom's just introverted, that's all. She'd say it with a smile, but I could tell she was a bit worried about me not having friends. While other children ran about the playground screaming with joy, climbing on the climbing frame, and chasing each other in games of tag, I preferred to sit on the bench near the old oak tree, watching. At school, the teachers tried their best to get me to join in. "Why don't you play with Michael and Sarah?" they'd suggest, or "The children are starting a game of hide and seek. Wouldn't that be fun?" But I was content in my own world. Even at home, I didn't play with toys the way other children did. No crashing car noises or elaborate action figure battles. Instead, I'd arrange my toys in neat rows and just look at them. Sometimes I'd organize them by color, other times by size or type. My mom once found me categorizing my stuffed animals by their scientific classifications. But here's the thing. In all those activities I mentioned, I wasn't completely alone. I had a friend. Well, sort of. He wasn't visible to anyone else, but he was as real to me as the bench I sat on or the oak tree that gave us shade. He wore fancy clothes, he told me, with a bow tie and what he called a proper gentleman's bowler hat, black and round. We'd spend hours together at the playground, having the most fascinating conversations. That bench by the oak tree near my home became our special spot. Every day after school, I'd head straight there, knowing he'd be waiting. He never disappointed. Rain or shine, hot or cold, he'd be there, ready to share another fascinating story or observation about the world around us. "Look at that ant colony," he'd say. His voice always reminded me of warm Earl Grey. "Did you know ants can lift 20 times their own weight?" He would continue. We'd watch the tiny insects for ages, making up stories about their miniature lives. He taught me about different species of ants, how they communicated with one another, and how they worked together to build their underground cities. Sometimes, we'd spend entire afternoons watching them carry bits of leaves and crumbs, imagining what grand purpose each tiny treasure might serve in their miniature kingdom. Our conversations weren't limited to insects, though. He taught me about poetry, explaining how words could paint pictures in people's minds. He'd recite verses that made ordinary things seem magical, how a fallen leaf could become a tiny boat on an epic journey, or how a spider's web could be nature's finest architecture. We'd discuss deep topics that most adults wouldn't bother sharing with a child, like why the sky changes colors at sunset, or why some people seem happy all the time, while others carry invisible weights on their shoulders. Sometimes, we'd have proper afternoon tea with invisible cups, and he'd tell me about tea etiquette. "Pinkies up, young Thomas," he'd say with a chuckle. "A proper gentleman always appreciates the subtle art of tea time." He'd describe elaborate tea ceremonies, teaching me about the difference between Yorkshire tea and PG tips, though our cups remained invisible. My parents noticed my behavior, of course. They'd watch from the kitchen window as I sat on our back garden patio, apparently talking to myself while holding an invisible teacup. I overheard them discussing it one night, their voices carrying through the heating vent to my bedroom upstairs. "Should we be concerned?" my dad asked. "Most kids his age have real friends." "Dr. Mitchell says it's just a phase," my mom replied. "She says some children process the world differently, and that's okay. He's creative, that's all." One particularly drizzly afternoon, we watched a proper thunderstorm roll in from our bench. Most children had run inside, but he convinced me to stay under the oak tree's branches. "Look at how the sky gets darker before it rains," he said. We sat there in the wind, and he showed me how to count the time between lightning and thunder to figure out the storm's distance. The really interesting part of this story, though, happened when I was 12. My teacher, Ms. Thompson, assigned us a project about our houses, their history, architecture, any interesting details we could find. Most children groaned about having to do research, but I was secretly excited. Our house had always felt special to me, and not just because of my invisible friend. It was a Victorian terraced house, built in the 1880s, with a small front garden and those intricate stone details that people don't bother with anymore. My favorite thing about it was the attic window, a small round portal that looked like an eye watching over our street. That's where I made my discovery. While digging through boxes in our attic, pushing past old Christmas decorations and my dad's university textbooks, I found a leather-bound trunk pushed far back under the eaves. Inside, beneath layers of yellowed newspapers and what looked like old letters, I found a photograph that made my heart stop. It was yellowed and slightly curved at the edges, but the image was clear. A man standing proudly wearing a bow tie and that distinctive bowler hat my friend had described so many times. Next to him were two dogs, and suddenly everything clicked into place. You see, my friend had often told me about his dogs, Biscuit and Gravy. He'd laugh about how he had to call them together on walks. Biscuit, Gravy. He thought it was hilarious to shout what sounded like a proper English breakfast order across the neighborhood. I'd always laughed along, even though I never saw the dogs myself. He'd tell me stories about their adventures, how Biscuit once chased a squirrel all the way up the oak tree, or how Gravy had a habit of hiding bones in the garden, only to forget where he'd buried them. The back of the photograph had elegant handwriting, Edwin P. Harrison, with Biscuit and Gravy, 1893. My hands were shaking as I carefully placed the photo in my rucksack and headed to the local library after school. The librarian, Mrs. Chen, helped me search through old town records and newspapers. We discovered that Edwin had been a moderately successful poet who'd owned our house for nearly 2 decades. He'd published 2 collections of poetry, Whispers of the Oak and Nature's Mirror, and had been known locally for his nature-themed verses and his regular columns in the town newspaper. I spent hours in the library that week, reading everything I could find about Edwin. His poetry was exactly the kind my friend would recite to me, full of observations about nature, the changing seasons, and the small miracles of everyday life. One poem in particular caught my attention, titled "The Bench." It described watching children play from a distance, understanding their joy but feeling separate from it. The last line read, "Sometimes the greatest adventures happen in the quiet spaces between moments." I'm an adult now, with a house of my own, but I still think about my childhood friend often. Some might find it unsettling to realize they spent their childhood talking to a spirit who lived over a century ago, but I don't. Instead, I find it comforting. Edwin chose to spend his time teaching a lonely child about poetry, insects, and the beauty of quiet observation. He showed me that being different wasn't wrong. It just meant I noticed things others might miss. The trunk from the attic now sits in my own study. Inside, I keep Edwin's photograph, some preserved newspapers featuring his columns, and a journal where I write down all the things I remember him teaching me. Sometimes, When I'm struggling with writing or feeling out of place in the world, I'll open it up and remember our conversations. Last summer, I visited my parents' house and took my own daughter to the playground. The old bench is still there, though it's been replaced a few times over the years. The oak tree is even bigger now, its shadows stretching longer across the grass. As we sat there together, my daughter pointed to an ant carrying a crumb and asked, "Where do you think it's going?" I smiled, remembering all those afternoons spent watching ants with Edwin. "Well," I said, "let's make up a story about it." And as we sat there, creating tales about the ants' grand adventures, I could have sworn I heard a familiar, warm Earl Grey voice say, "Pinkies up, young Thomas." Sometimes, when I visit that playground alone, I'll sit on that old bench. And while I can't see Edwin anymore, I like to think he's still there, maybe teaching another quiet child about the secret lives of ants, or the proper way to hold an invisible teacup. The quiet flat. I knew living in London would be expensive, but I honestly wasn't prepared for just how bad it would be. I ended up sharing this tiny 2-bedroom flat with 4 other girls because that was all I could afford. It wasn't great, but what could you do when rent costs more than your paycheck? The flat itself was a 3rd-floor walk-up in this old Victorian building that probably hadn't seen any real maintenance since before I was born. Living with 4 strangers wasn't exactly at the London dream I'd imagined when I moved here from Manchester. The flat was a constant mess. Dishes piling up in the sink, laundry draped over every radiator, weird stains appearing on the carpet like they owned the place. Every morning was a battle for the bathroom, all of us trying to get ready for work at the same time. The kitchen was even worse. 5 different sets of groceries crammed into one tiny fridge, everyone labeling their food with passive-aggressive notes like, "Please don't eat this." The noise was constant too. Someone was always on a phone call, or watching videos without headphones, or having friends over. Even at night, there was no escape. The walls were so thin you could hear every whispered conversation, every creak of a bed, every midnight snack run. I'd started sleeping with earplugs, but even those couldn't block out the chaos completely. Don't get me wrong, my roommates weren't bad people, just different. And as you can probably tell, I was in desperate need of some time alone. And then, somehow, the impossible happened. One weekend, thanks to some cosmic alignment, they all left. Between trips, family visits, and whatever else, they scattered across the country, leaving me alone in our tiny, overcrowded flat for the first time in 8 months. The moment they were gone, the quiet settled in like a long-lost friend. Finally. That first night, I cleaned like I was on a mission. Hours melted together as I took back control from the mess. Every wiped-down counter, every emptied sink felt like winning a tiny battle. By midnight, the flat was barely recognizable. Not just clean, but full of possibility instead of frustration. The transformation lasted less than a day, though. I came back from my cafe shift the next evening to find the flat in total disarray. But this wasn't our usual lived-in mess. This felt deliberate. My carefully arranged bookshelf had been flipped upside down and reorganized, but not into chaos. The books were lined up in perfect alphabetical order. The dishes I'd washed were back in the sink. Not dirty, but stacked in precise geometric patterns, like someone had been playing with them as if they were Lego bricks. A peculiar smell filled the flat, like wet dirt and old books, or like a library left to rot underground. The smell stuck to everything, all the pillows and clothes, but when I opened the windows, it disappeared instantly. I cleaned up the mess again, tried to convince myself maybe I was the one who did these things, and tried not to overreact. But when I went to bed that night, the whispering started. It came from the walls at first, too faint to catch any words, but you could tell it was a conversation. Urgent, like they were trying to keep something secret. I pressed my ear to the cool plaster, convincing myself it had to be the neighbors, or the pipes, or anything but what it sounded like. A crowd of people standing just on the other side of the thinnest walls imaginable. The whispers followed me from room to room. When I turned on music to drown them out, the voices adjusted, becoming just loud enough to be heard over whatever I played. They seemed to be discussing me, my movements, my attempts to ignore them. Sometimes they laughed. I turned the lights on, hoping it would help, but that's when I noticed the shadows. They bent in ways shadows shouldn't, like they were alive. They pooled in corners and stretched across ceilings, twisting into shapes that almost looked like people before fading away. I'd catch flashes of movement in the corner of my eye, but whenever I turned, the room was empty. I tried to steady myself in the bathroom, but my reflection lagged, moving a split second after I did. And sometimes I'd see faces, others, floating behind mine, vanishing the moment I tried to focus on them. My heart raced as I watched, unable to look away. I turned on the shower, desperate for any comfort, but the water stayed ice cold no matter how much I adjusted the temperature. It had that same musty smell of decay. I tried to get away from all of this nonsense by heading to a local pub that evening, sipping on a glass of wine until even the bartender's concerned looks got too much. When I came back, I found the furniture in the living room rearranged into a perfect circle, all facing the center where a single cup of tea sat steaming. It was from my personal collection, one I'd packed away in a box under my bed. The tea was still hot. I left the place again immediately and spent that night at a 24-hour cafe. The next evening, things reached their peak. Every door in the flat slammed shut at once, and I heard all the locks click simultaneously. The lights flickered and died, leaving me in total darkness, except for an eerie glow seeping under every door. The whispers turned into a chorus of voices, all talking over each other until it felt like my head would burst. The shadows moved like they were alive, stretching out with tendrils that looked solid enough to touch. The smell of decay became overwhelming, and the temperature dropped until I could see my breath in the air. In that moment, trapped in the darkness with those voices and shadows closing in, I knew I couldn't stay in the flat any longer. My bedroom window seemed like the only escape. Looking down at the street below, I made a choice that felt both terrible and inevitable. The fall wasn't far, just far enough. I remember the impact, the crack of bone, and the strange relief that came with the pain. I woke up in the hospital a few days later with a shattered hip. The nurses spoke softly about stress and exhaustion, about needing rest and support. My roommates visited with awkward concern, bringing magazines and forced conversation. None of us mentioned how I'd ended up there. When I finally returned to the flat, leaning heavily on crutches, everything was exactly as it should be. The rooms held nothing but ordinary shadows and normal sounds. The mirrors reflected exactly what they should. The smell of decay had been replaced by the usual urban apartment potpourri of takeaway and laundry. The flat feels mostly normal again now, but that normality feels like it's just a thin layer covering something much bigger and more patient. I know I should be looking for a new place, but with little money and few options, it feels like I'm stuck here a little longer. The Watcher of Loch Ness. It's interesting how memories change when you look back at them. What seemed real at the time starts to feel like a dream, or maybe a nightmare. I've been a journalist for 15 years, and I've made my name exposing fake ghost stories and monster sightings. I thought I knew exactly where to draw the line between real and fake. But after what happened at Loch Ness last week, I'm not so sure anymore. I can't stop seeing it when I close my eyes. The moonlight on the black water, something standing there that shouldn't exist, and eyes that looked right through me and my soul. But let me start from the beginning while I can still tell this story like a proper journalist. 2 weeks ago, I got to the little village of Drumnadroshit on a cold Tuesday morning in late October. The place was exactly what you'd expect from a tourist trap. Gift shops packed with stuffed monsters and cheap telescopes, cafes with names like Nessie's Nook and Monster Munchies. I remember thinking how I was going to tear this whole setup apart in my article. The morning fog was unlike any I had seen, quiet and endless. The locals walked through it like it was nothing, while tourists huddled in cafes, pressing their faces against windows as the world outside disappeared into white. My first stop was the Loch Ness Center and exhibition. I spent hours watching tourists get excited over blurry photos and weird sonar readings. Their need to believe in monsters really got under my skin. Every time someone pointed at a shadow in the water and called it proof, I felt myself getting more and more annoyed. "Look at the way the water moves there," some tourist said, pointing at a video screen. "That's not normal waves," he added. "Water follows the laws of physics, not fairy tales," I said, probably sounding like a jerk. But I was enjoying this moment. The gift shop was packed with I Believe t-shirts and stuff. I bought one as a joke, thinking it would make for a funny picture next to the article. The old lady at the register had shaky hands when she folded it. I saw how she avoided touching the monster picture on the shirt and asked her if there was a reason for that. But all she did was smile and say, "I hope you have a lovely experience here at Drumnadroshit." That night, I went to the pub at the Drumnadroshit Hotel. Tourist spots tell you what people want to believe, but pubs tell you what they really believe after a few drinks. The place looked exactly like you'd imagine a Scottish pub. Dark wood everywhere, old brass fixtures, and old men who looked as ancient as the mountains outside. I sat next to this fisherman who looked old enough to remember when they built the lake. His face was all deep wrinkles, and his eyes were the color of storm clouds. I pulled out my recorder, ready to collect some crazy stories. "So," I said, ordering us both whiskey, "tell me about this monster Nessie. You must have seen it yourself, fishing here so long?" The old man didn't look up from his drink, but his whole body tensed. like someone who just heard a noise in a dark room. "What makes you think I'm a fisherman?" he asked, catching me completely off guard. Not because I thought I was incorrect, but because I couldn't believe he would even ask. He had sunburned cheeks, smelled like fish, and wore a green fisherman's jacket covered in scales. I chuckled. It doesn't take much to make an assumption like that. The fisherman chuckled quietly, a hint of a smile on his lips. He didn't look up from his drink, though. "You're asking the wrong questions, boy." "Oh, yeah?" I couldn't help sounding smug. "What should I be asking about?" He turned to me then, and as I got a good look at his face, my smile disappeared. Scars ran across his skin, and I realized one of his eyes was fake. "You came looking for the beast, but it's the watcher you should fear," he said. He didn't try to scare me, didn't lean in, or lower his voice. He just said it, simple as breathing, and that was enough. I ordered another round, hoping he'd say more, but he just got up and walked out into the fog, leaving me with a full glass and the distinct impression that I was now part of a story. The next morning, I decided to dig deeper into what this watcher business was all about. But people around town got weird whenever I brought it up. Not in a big way, but enough to notice. They would get quiet mid-conversation or find reasons to be somewhere else. At the general store, an elderly woman overheard me asking the clerk about it. She just set down her shopping basket and walked out without a word. I spent the next few days in the local library, going through dusty old books and records. While the watcher never showed up in any official documents, I kept finding mentions of it in personal writings, old journals, letters, and church records, and a pattern started to show up. People over the years described the same thing. Not quite human, not quite ghost, always standing at the point where land met water, like it was guarding something in the depths of the lake. The missing persons cases were harder to ignore. People who spent too much time looking for the lake's secrets sometimes vanished. Others were found floating in the morning fog, their faces frozen in looks of pure horror. Official reports called them accidents, but the local stories all whispered about the watcher. It took me 3 days to track down Margaret McPherson for an interview. She lived in a cottage at the edge of town, the kind of place you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. When she opened the door to my knock, I stopped doubting the stories I'd heard. One look at her face told me she'd seen something that had left its mark. "I was 16, she said, after I convinced her to talk. Her hands shook as she poured tea. "Walking home late from my friend's house. The path goes right by the lake. I thought I saw someone standing by the water. She spilled tea everywhere when she tried to put the cup down." "What did it look like?" I asked, leaning closer. She shook her head. I can't describe it right. It wasn't shaped right. Nothing should look like that. But the worst part, her eyes got distant, like she was seeing it all over again. It turned and looked at me, just for a second. But then I ran. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life. That's the only reason why I'm still here. She wouldn't say anything else, but no one could fake being that scared and traumatized. Still, the rational part of my brain said there had to be a normal explanation. Small towns need their scary stories. The watcher was probably just something they made up to keep tourist money coming in when Nessie wasn't enough. So, I had to prove it one way or another. That night, I lugged my camera gear down to the lock, ready to expose this thing for what it was. The water stretched out black under the full moon, still as glass. Perfect conditions to catch any would-be monsters or watchers in the act. I set up my equipment and started recording my usual skeptic's commentary about local myths. But then the silence hit me. Not the peaceful quiet of a late night by the water, but something deeper, an absence. No wind in the grass, no lapping waves, not even the usual chirp of insects. Just me and my voice, which got suddenly too loud in that perfect stillness. Something moved in the corner of my eye. I turned, hoping it was the old fisherman coming to warn me again. It wasn't the fisherman. I can't describe what was standing there between the water and the land. My brain won't let me. It wasn't scary like a monster or ghost, but it made my mind shut down, like trying to read a book written in non-existent letters. "Hello?" I called out. "I'm doing a story about the lake and someone called the Watcher. Would you answer some questions?" I tried to break the silence. It didn't move. It didn't speak. It just watched. I lifted my camera, holding on to my journalist instincts like a shield. That's when I made the biggest mistake of my life. Through the camera lens, I looked right into its eyes. In a blink, it was suddenly rushing toward me, faster than anything I'd ever seen. I tried to ask it to speak, but before I could finish, something hit me with a force no person could have, and I was thrown backward. The world flipped as I hit the water. The lock swallowed me whole, the cold like black ice, knocking the air from my lungs. I kicked and thrashed, but the water wasn't just deep. It had weight, intention. It wasn't letting me go. It was pulling me under. Then something stirred below, something vast. And suddenly, I understood. The Watcher wasn't the horror. The Watcher was the warning. Next thing I remember is coughing up water on the shore, the old fisherman's rough hands pounding my back. My camera and all my gear were gone, but I don't remember dropping them. Maybe they're still down there, recording things no one should see. "Told you about the Watcher, didn't I?" the fisherman said, helping me up. His weathered hands were steady against my shaking shoulders. We walked back to his truck in silence, my shoes squelching with each step. He turned up the heat and handed me an old wool blanket that smelled of tobacco and sea salt. For a long time, we just sat there, watching the fog dance across the loch's surface. "How'd you know to come?" I finally asked, my teeth still chattering. He lit a cigarette, the ember glowing like a distant warning light. "Been fishing these waters 40 years. You learn to read the signs. When the Watcher appears, it means something stirring down below, something hungry." He took a long drag. "Saw you heading down here with your camera. Knew you wouldn't listen if I tried to stop you. All those people who disappeared." I tried to form a sentence, but the words wouldn't come. "Some folks say they drowned. Simple as that." He tapped ash out the window. "But I've seen what happens. Watcher appears, and then someone gets too curious. Next thing, the water takes them. Not like regular drowning, more like a claiming." I thought about what lurked beneath my feet while I was in the water. "And you've seen it before? The Watcher?" "Twice. First time, I was young and stupid like you. Second time, he went quiet for a moment. Second time, I couldn't save them. I stayed 3 more days in Drumnadrachit, trying to make sense of what had happened. As I walked past the tourist shops with their cartoon monsters, I'd stop, stare into Nessie's eyes for a moment, and just remain silent. These shops had no idea what they were making light of, what ancient thing they were turning into keychains and coffee mugs. I'm home now, trying to write my article, but it's not the takedown piece I planned. I keep thinking about the fisherman's words, about things that wait in deep water, patient and hungry, about guardians that stand between us and things we're not meant to understand.